around 1977, and then we can see the increase in overweight and obesity largely being driven by this obesity line here, subsequent to the dietary guidelines. Now, this is just to make an observation that there is an association. And yes, we've had discussions in these hearings as to, do we consider this to be causal? And we need to offer an explanation for what happened here. And an obvious explanation is that the dietary guidelines changed at about this point. The alternative, or an alternative that is being offered, to use Gary Tobis's terminology, is that we woke up somewhere around this point and decided to become greedy and lazy. We had managed to stay slim for 3.5 million years, but suddenly 30% of us became obese and almost 70% of us overweight or obese. And for diabetes, in 1976, 2.4%. By 2010, 11% actually diabetic, 35% considered pre-diabetic. The references for those are here. In the UK, 1.4% in 1980, 6% in 2015. So since the guidelines were introduced, US obesity has more than doubled, UK obesity has increased almost tenfold, US diabetes has increased sevenfold, and UK diabetes has increased 4 to 5-fold. What I say at the end of this thesis chapter is that this at least deserves examination. We are failing our populations if we do not look at the association between obesity and diabetes and the introduction of those dietary guidelines. Now, the limiting belief, when I said that the explanation offered for that increase in obesity is that we essentially started to eat more and do less, we became greedy and lazy, it is because that there's a general principle held that as human beings we need to eat less and do more. And as a specific belief held, we need to eat fewer calories so that we lose weight. That is putting it in its most simplest term, but there is a particular weight to energy formula that we humans have introduced. And it is put here by the British Dietetic Association as 1 pound of fat contains 3,500 calories. So to lose 1 pound a week, you need a deficit of 500 calories a day. That essentially is the conventional wisdom as to how we can address the obesity epidemic. And it came up in the testimony of Professor Forster. And Professor Forster does what many people do, which is to justify that view by referring to the laws of thermodynamics. But there are not one law of thermodynamics, there are 4 laws of thermodynamics, and not one of those laws says that energy in equals energy out. So thermodynamics were introduced because the researchers in the 17 and 1800s were trying to understand if we could get a perfectly efficient steam engine. Could we put coal into a steam engine and then the engine would travel a certain distance and we not lose any energy? And they quickly found that we did lose energy. We could not create a perfectly efficient system. So the first law of thermodynamics actually says in a closed system, in thermal equilibrium, energy can neither be created nor destroyed, it shall be conserved. That does not say energy in equals energy out. That is then qualified with the second law of thermodynamics, and I have not yet met a dietitian who is aware of the second law of thermodynamics. And the second law is also called the law of common sense, or to give it its proper name, it's called the law of entropy. And it says energy will be lost, and energy will be used up in making that energy available. We turn the kettle on, we use up energy in making the water hot. What we want is the hot water, and of course we lose steam out of the spout. So we lose that energy. So those 2 laws together need to be considered. Now, some brilliant work was done by a Swiss scientist in the early 2000s. Jecquier looked at the thermic effect of macronutrients. I'll explain that immediately. So Jecquier said, if we eat 100 calories of carbohydrate, how many of those calories become available to the body? And the same for protein and the same for fat. And he found that for carbohydrate and fat, the amount was quite similar. So we eat 100 calories of carbohydrate, approximately 94 are available to the body as energy. And for fat, it's approximately 95. protein is very interesting. Protein takes a lot of digestion by the body, so perhaps only 70 to 75 calories become available to the body. So immediately a calorie cannot be a calorie because we do not get the same number of calories the minute we put them into the human body. So saying energy in equals energy out, and there is this perfect relationship between the number of calories in and the number of calories out, is an extremely limiting belief. It is blocking progress in the area that it is not the number of calories that we eat, it is the type of those calories. And even if it were the case that energy in equals energy out, then surely less energy in would mean less energy out. And if anyone in the audience has been on a low-calorie diet, as indeed I have, Madam Chair, one does know that the minute you start putting less energy in, you simply have less energy. You are tired and exhausted and disinterested in life in general. It is not a sustainable way to overcome the obesity epidemic. And we must remember that thermodynamics, the word thermo means heat, and dynamics means movement. And it's about the movement of heat. It is not about weight. Thermodynamics says nothing whatsoever about weight. It never did, it never will. We humans introduced this formula to convert this notion of energy into this notion of calories in food and the weight of that food, and calories in humans and the weight of that human. But this calorie theory is wrong. So to understand where that 1 pound equals 3,500 calories, and you would find it in a woman's magazine or a men's magazine on the shelves today, you'll find it in government documents, you will find it in dietary documents from dietitians. So I wanted to understand how that number could come about. 1 pound does equal 454 grams. 1 gram of fat is commonly held to equal 9 calories, but that is not actually the case. We'll come back to that. And 1 pound of human fat tissue is assumed to be approximately 87% lipid. Again, 87% fat. Again, we'll come back to that. Put all of those together and you can establish a number close to 3,500 calories. And you may think that that's close enough, but if you look at this statement from the National Obesity Forum in the UK, it says 1 fewer 50-calorie plain biscuit per day could lose you 5 pounds in a year. They simply multiply the number of calories by the number of days, divide it by 3,500 and come out with the number 5. And 1 extra biscuit means you could gain that in a year. Well, actually the formula, even the most generous I can be to try and get near 3,500 calories, the formula is more than 50 calories out. So we're gaining or losing 5 pounds a year just by the math being wrong. There's no biscuits needed. So if we look at the true range of numbers, we'll keep that one, that's fine. 1 gram of fat, and this is just looking at a few documents. I could probably find more that would widen that range further. So this is looking at work that Livesey did for the Food and Agricultural Organisation workshop in 2002, and the Wishnowsky paper from 1958. And Wishnowsky thought fat had 9.5 calories per gram. If you're a calorie counter, by the way, this is very, very important. And Livesey thought it probably had around 8.7 calories a gram. And this number for the 87% lipid actually comes from a Bosenrad 1911 paper. And in that same paper, he said, well, the human body could be 72% lipid, it could be 87% lipid, it could be anywhere in between. So if we take the lower of each of those numbers, we can establish that 1 pound in fact equals 2,800 calories. If we take the higher, we can establish that 1 pound equals 3,700 calories. Now the number in red in the brackets, if we currently believe that 1 pound equals 3,500 calories, and in fact it equals 2,800, we could inadvertently gain 84 pounds every single year. If in fact it is 3,700, we are going to lose 26 pounds, 13 kilos in any 1 year. That is how absurd this calorie theory is, and yet it is our current exclusive solution to the obesity epidemic. So I asked public health authorities, where does this come from? I think that the calorie theory might derive from a document, it's a book, booklet to be precise, written by Lulu Hunt Peters in 1918, where she said 500 calories would be approximately 2 ounces of fat, 2 ounces approximately 4 pounds. Cutting out 1,000 calories a day would equal a reduction of approximately 8 pounds per month or 96 pounds per year. So the calorie theory would have us believe that I could cut back by 1,000 calories per day and lose approximately 100 pounds over the next year. That would leave me at approximately 10 pounds, Madam Chair. So I asked the British health authorities, where does this information come from? The British Dietetic Association, the National Health Service, the National Institute for Clinical Excellence, the Department of Health, the National Obesity Forum, Dietitians in Obesity Management, and the Association for the Study of Obesity. 3 of them came back and said, and the question was very simple, please can you source the 3,500 calorie formula, and please can you prove it? And 3 came back and said, I'm very sorry, we can't, we'll refer you to other organisations. The Department of Health in the United Kingdom says we're unaware of the rationale behind the weight formula you refer to. I don't refer to it, it's in their documentation. The National Institute of Clinical Excellence, that's the body who has to preside over all evidence within the UK in matters of health. And they said, yes, whilst we are the body that should preside over that such information, we do not hold any information on that particular matter. So the 2 that tried to answer the question were the dietitians in obesity management and the Association for the Study of Obesity, and they independently came up with the same one study. And the dietitians said there's good evidence that a 600 calorie deficit will produce weight differences of approximately 5 kilograms at 1 year. And the Association for the Study of Obesity referred to that same study, put more flesh on the bones. Of course, I knew the study. One study, 12 people, a 600 calorie a day deficit for 1 year. That's pretty severe. Should have been, just apply the formula, 62.57 pounds of fat lighter by the end of the year. They were, in fact, on average, 11 pounds lighter. And there was a range of 0.8 pounds up to 17 pounds. Now, a formula should be a formula. There should be no variation. It should not matter what the gender is of the person, what the age, what the weight profile before we start. A 3,500 calorie formula should apply to every individual. And they cannot make it work on 12 people when given the opportunity to present any evidence that they wish to present. Additionally, that is only fat, and we would lose more on top in terms of water. So the actual weight loss should have been nearer 80 pounds across the whole year. And there are 1.5 billion overweight people in the world, and we cannot prove this formula on 12 people. And this is our strategy for resolving the obesity epidemic.
Now, Dr. Harcombe, the weighty question will be, what's the way forward in your view?
I like to look for areas of commonality as much as looking for areas of difference. I don't seek to be in conflict, but I will say what I find. And I think a way that both sides could find agreement is if we stopped confusing saturated fatty acids with processed food. So this is a list of the primary sources of saturated fat in the US diet: pizza, desserts, candies, tacos, ready meals, all other food categories, not stuff that we recognise as real food. Our side would say, this is not real food, do not eat it. Now, if the conventional wisdom wants to say also do not eat this stuff, we could find agreement, but call it what it is. Say do not eat processed food, and we would violently agree with you, but stop calling it saturated fat, because it's predominantly junk. It is predominantly processed food. You will find more carbohydrate in virtually every food on this list than you will fat, and you will find more unsaturated fat in virtually every food here than you will saturated fat. Because, of course, as we remember from Friday, there is only one food group that has more saturated than unsaturated fat, and that is dairy products. So that is not saturated fat. Stop demonizing the saturated fat in cheese, milk, butter, nuts and seeds, these foods of outstanding nutritional quality, in the name of saturated fat. The same in the UK. The UK thinks that saturated fat are bread and cakes and pastries and confectionery, processed food, processed meat, the things that we would not eat, and ideally the other side would not recommend either. And again, milk, cream, cheese, fresh meat, fish, eggs. Eggs, fish, meat contributes but 7% of the saturated fat in the UK. This could be a way forward. So our one message, and it's been a theme throughout this hearing, is we need to eat real food. And I put it in my thesis in the final chapter. It does not seem logical to advise populations away from carcass meat, dairy produce, eggs, nuts and seeds in the name of saturated fat, when the modern processed foods, biscuits, cakes, pizza, desserts, ready meals, are more sensibly related to modern illness. The Surgeon Captain Peter Cleve, this is an often quoted statement of his, for a modern disease to be related to an old-fashioned food, such as red meat, is one of the most ludicrous things I've ever heard in my life. ADSA sponsors notwithstanding, and I do think that this causes a problem because it's difficult to embrace wholeheartedly the concept of real food when your sponsors include cereal companies and sugar companies and makers of polyunsaturated products. It's inevitably going to lead you towards demonizing real food and favoring those processed foods. But if we can get that conflict out of the way, surely we can agree on real food, and the only then valid nutritional debate that the world should be having is what should that real food be. We've seen this slide. I presented this slide at the February 2015 conference here in Cape Town, and it looks at a number of different foods and it compares foods that we know to be particularly nutritionally dense, chicken liver, oily fish and eggs, and it looks at the nutrient density of those foods. You saw this in presentation 4, slide 114 from Professor Noakes' presentation, so I won't go over it again, but you can clearly see that it is driving us to eat animal foods, and there will never be a non-animal food that can beat an animal food for all the nutrients, not least because they do not contain complete protein and they don't contain many nutrients that are exclusive to animal foods. That's then just looking at minerals. We would expect carbohydrates to do better in minerals than would animal foods. The animal foods are still scoring most of the wins as indicated by the red. And this, Madam Chair, is where chocolate would come in, because had I known, if I put cocoa powder in any one of these columns, it knocks all the others into a hat. It is so rich in magnesium and copper and iron and zinc. I would recommend, or I would give you information, and you could choose to do with it as you wish, that dark chocolate on a daily basis would be an excellent choice that you could make, Madam Chair. So the most nutritious foods are of animal origin, and therefore, if we remember back to that coloured slide from earlier on this morning, the animal origin foods are naturally on that right-hand side of the chart, naturally low or void of carbohydrate and naturally high in fat. Now, because I've become involved in this hearing by being invited to be an expert witness to talk on the dietary guidelines, I have made an observation in terms of this quote has appeared a number of times during the transcripts, which I went through in preparation for this. And this has been quoted that practitioners, if we're looking at how to help populations with these epidemics we're facing, practitioners should provide adequate information to give the patient options and alternatives to enable them to make choices pertaining to their own health and that of others. In my opinion, practitioners should be doing these things: to not share the fact that ADSA and possibly other advice is conflicted, in my opinion, would be unprofessional and unethical. To not share the fact that global dietary guidelines are without evidence base would be unprofessional and unethical. To not share the fact that when 30% fat is wrong, 55% carbohydrate is concomitantly wrong would be unprofessional and unethical. And to not share the fact that the most nutritious foods are of animal origin and naturally low carbohydrate, high fat would be unprofessional and unethical, as all the above would deny patients information, options, and the chance to make informed choices. People will be mightily reassured that this is my final slide before we can move to a break and a much needed cup of tea. I have only met Professor Noakes twice. I met him at the conference in February 2015. It was quite a surprise to be invited to appear as an expert witness, but I am of course familiar with the impact that he's had on the world of nutrition, and my view of him as a person and why I've made this effort to come to this hearing is that essentially he's an A1 rated scientist, yes, but he's a man who researches, writes and presents to provide patients and any other interested members of the public evidence-based information so that they have the options to make informed choices about their health. And he's globally recognised for the immense courage and contribution that he has shown in performing this work. Thank you, Madam Chair, for listening to my first presentation.
Now, Dr. Harcombe, just to round off with this, there is some suggestion that or rather maybe I should put it this way. When we look at the United States dietary guidelines and those that are used in the UK, we look at the South African dietary-based guidelines. What are the similarities or what are the differences?
They're remarkably similar. Of course, I looked at this, it would have been inappropriate not to. So I've looked at the United States 1980 guidelines and the South African 2003 guidelines and 2013, and the similarities are quite striking. So the first statement in both, South Africa enjoy a variety of foods, the US eat a variety of foods, South Africa makes starchy foods part of most meals. This is quite interesting because the 2003 guidelines said make starchy foods the basis of most meals rather than part of most meals. So perhaps there was an observation in those 10 years that the quantity of starchy carbohydrates perhaps did need to be limited, and the US guidelines say eat foods with adequate starch and fibre. The South African guidelines say use fat sparingly, the American guidelines say avoid too much fat. The South African guidelines say use sugar and foods and drinks high in sugar sparingly. And again, I'd like to draw the panel's attention to another subtle change for the 2013 guidelines to 2003, because you avoid foods and drinks high in sugar was previously containing sugar. So that sugar guideline has actually been watered down to avoiding foods and drinks containing sugar to avoiding drinks and foods high in sugar. And of course, we know that Hewlett's have a relationship with ASDA. And use salt and foods high in salt sparingly, avoid too much sodium. So there are remarkable similarities. And in my particular area of expertise, the most important fact to note is when you go to the dietary fat guideline in the South Africa guidelines, it says less than or equal to 30% dietary fat. So the one main dietary guideline that has established every other aspect of our diet is key to the South African dietary guidelines.